Part 1. From Civil War II, US-China-Taiwan Triangle, it is the 1940s. And China is tearing itself apart in a long civil war. The ruling nationalist government is rapidly losing ground to a disciplined, communist movement backed by the Soviet Union and led by Mao Zedong. Mao's forces sweep south, pushing the nationalists all the way to the coast. Under pressure, the nationalist leadership and more than 1 million soldiers and loyal civilians evacuate by ship and plane across a narrow strait to a large Chinese island. Japan had seized this island decades earlier, but the victors of World War II had just agreed it should be returned to China. Mao's army cannot follow. They lack the navy and air force needed to cross the water. For the moment, the nearly defeated Republic of China has a safe refuge. This is not just any island. 4 centuries earlier, Portuguese sailors arrived and called it Ilha Formosa, beautiful island, and for centuries it was coveted for its fertile land and strategic location in Asia's sea lanes. After 50 years under Japanese rule, the island now commonly known as Taiwan comes back under Chinese control at the end of the war. The nationalist government relocates there and declares it the temporary seat of the Republic of China. On the mainland, Mao proclaims the founding of the People's Republic of China, promising to restore national greatness after a century of foreign domination. The Soviet Union recognizes Mao's government as the legitimate regime of China within a day. But the Civil War does not really end. Both the exiled nationalists on Taiwan and the communists in Beijing claim to be the one true government of all China. From their island base, the nationalists rule under martial law, jailing, exiling, or executing suspected communists. Dissidents, or advocates of Taiwanese independence. Mao, meanwhile, begins building a navy and air force to one day cross the strait and finish the job. At this point, the United States looms in the background. They have just defeated Japan and are trying to pull back from Asia, even as they watch these revolutions with concern. Washington refuses to recognize Mao's new regime and is deeply uneasy that the world's most populous country has gone communist. But US leaders focus primarily on rebuilding Europe and containing Soviet influence there, even forming a new military alliance for that purpose. The Soviets, once wartime partners, are now nuclear-armed rivals after testing their own bomb in 1949. President Truman, as Secretary of State, famously draws a defense perimeter. That outside zone includes Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam, places where communist movements are on the rise and being recognized by Moscow and Beijing. Anti-communist hardliners in Washington are furious, warning that Taiwan will soon fall. Truman insists that China's civil war is an internal matter and that the US will not intervene. That is the policy until everything changes. In the summer of 1950, troops from the Soviet-aligned North Korean regime pour across the 38th parallel into the US-aligned South. They nearly overrun the entire peninsula in 11 weeks, armed with Soviet weapons and backed by Joseph Stalin. The invasion goes forward only after Stalin and Mao both sign off. Mao knows participation could provoke the United States, but feels compelled to support fellow revolutionaries. eventually sending Chinese forces into Korea to help fight the Americans. The US has no troops in Korea when the attack begins. By its own map, Korea is outside the American perimeter. But the rapid collapse of the South makes Washington see a coordinated communist campaign across Asia, threatening to turn the map red. The US reverses course, sends troops under the UN flag, and pushes back. In a national address, Truman announces intervention in Korea and, in the same speech, orders a major naval force to the waters around Taiwan to prevent any attack on the island. Overnight, Washington decides it will not allow Mao to seize Taiwan. To justify this turn, Truman leans on a legal nuance. He argues that Taiwan's final status was never fully settled. Japan renounced its claim after World War II, but no treaty explicitly named a new sovereign. Therefore, he says, Taiwan's status is undetermined, giving the US cover to step in as protector without formally recognizing Mao's, or the Nationalists' claim. Mao likely comes to see his green light for the Korean invasion as a strategic blunder. It brings US forces to his doorstep, blocks his path to Taiwan, and helps lock the Korean peninsula into a bloody stalemate that endures at the demilitarized zone to this day. By 1953, it is clear that the US presence in Asia will be long-term, justified by a new mission containing communism through a chain of island bases with Taiwan in a pivotal position. Congress grants the president broad authority to defend Taiwan, including the option to deploy nuclear weapons on the island. Mao, facing domestic upheaval and eager to rally support, tests the situation by bombarding offshore islands still held by the Nationalists with tens of thousands of artillery rounds. Washington responds by drawing up plans for potential nuclear strikes on mainland Chinese targets, estimating casualties in the hundreds of thousands or more. Though those plans remain on paper, the US does send to supercarriers scores of combat aircraft and nuclear-capable missiles to the region, backed by forces in Japan and the Philippines. The Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev warns that any US attack on China would be treated as an attack on the USSR, risking a nuclear World War III. Both sides ultimately step back from the brink, but the US keeps large forces, including nuclear weapons, in and around Taiwan, while both Chinese governments continue a ritual of low-level shelling across the strait for years. Over the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the US presence in Asia hardens around a strategic island chain, with Taiwan in the center. The Soviets pour aid and technology into the PRC, helping Beijing develop its own nuclear arsenal, which China tests successfully in 1964. But the once tight Sino-Soviet partnership soon frays. Mao's radical campaign's massive social engineering projects, purges, and experiments in farming and industry result in famine and political chaos, killing tens of millions. Soviet leaders conclude that Mao is reckless and destabilizing. Mao accuses Moscow of compromising with capitalism and betraying true Marxism. The relationship deteriorates so badly that they clash along their shared border, and Soviet officials even float the idea of striking Chinese nuclear sites. By the late 1960s, the US sees an opportunity. If the two communist giants are splitting, Washington might exploit that rift. Richard Nixon wins the U.S. presidency in 1968 with a promise to reshape Cold War strategy. And he and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, decide to play the China card. With no official ties to Beijing, they use Pakistan as a go-between. In 1971, Kissinger secretly flies to Beijing, slipping away under the pretense of rest in Pakistan. Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai welcomed this opening not because they trust the US, but because they now view the Soviet Union with missiles pointed at China as the more immediate threat. But there is a condition. They will not move toward friendship while the US keeps troops and nuclear weapons on Taiwan. In their first private talks, Zhou walks Kissinger through the history how the US initially accepted that Taiwan would return to China after World War II, then reversed course during the Korean War and declared Taiwan's status undetermined while turning it into a US-backed military bastion. Kissinger admits that without Korea, Taiwan probably would have ended up under Beijing's control. He says the new administration is less ideologically obsessed with communism and more focused on great power balance, signaling that the US can work with a communist China. Zhou insists that any progress requires Washington to accept the idea that there is only one China and that Taiwan is part of it. Kissinger replies that the US does not support two Chinas or one China, one Taiwan, and hints that over time political realities may evolve in Beijing's favor without spelling out how or when. He promises not to back Taiwanese independence and says US troops will leave the island, while asking China to help wind down the Vietnam War by pushing its Vietnamese allies toward negotiations and prisoner releases. With that, the two sides take the first steps toward a strategic realignment that will reshape the global order.